It's been a pretty exciting last little while for me, being called to interview with the Pastoral Search Committee just about 3 weeks ago, and then hearing of their recommendation, and then meeting with many of you this past Monday for another grueling round of questioning. I'm usually fairly reluctant to speak too quickly, to commit towards things that I haven't really had time to think through. I've told Shosh that I think my synapses are wired from my heart to my brain and then down into my left arm for writing. And as soon as my mouth gets mixed up in there, it can cause some short-circuiting. But those meetings were actually pretty fun. I mean, they were with you guys, and I got to know a little bit more about you too from your questions and the great variety of what matters to you, from the theological down to the practical details of being a church. During my search committee meeting, for example, questions ranged from things like Rockway's presence on social media all the way to whether I believe in God. That last one was a bit unexpected. Do you believe in God? Are you even allowed to ask that during an interview? Isn't that like a human rights violation in Canada or something? I mean, I'm kidding, of course, because this was an interview for being a pastor, and I want to be asked that. That's like my bread and butter, as it probably is for a lot of you. It's something I've had my whole life to think about, including a lot of my grad school work, so I wasn't exactly unprepared. But it's also something that feels like it might take the rest of my life to really be prepared to answer, and probably even a little bit longer than that. I considered doing my sermon this morning on that question because I felt like I had a lot more to say about, the Anabaptist faith that I grew up in, and how it didn't totally make sense to me until I started learning about the medieval mystical tradition and people like Dionysius the Areopagite. But that all felt a little heavy and would kind of put me on the hook a little bit. I've also mentioned a few times this year how much I value preaching from the lectionary, the common ground of Scripture that we have. So I decided, forget all that other stuff, and let's just go with the lectionary. Well, sure enough, I click through to the lectionary page for this Sunday, and the very first line at the top is Acts 17. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." Reading that really was a moment for me. When I spoke about Dionysius the Areopagite in my interview, the very man that Paul converts at the end of that Acts passage, I had no idea I was going to preach this morning. And the fact that that is the lectionary passage is just forcing my hand. So apologies to the search committee for repeating myself a bit here. And it is about negative theology. So I just hope it's somewhat uplifting for you as it has been for me. The truth is that the Bible isn't always uplifting, except for Jesus, of course, uplifting himself on the cross. That's a crucifixion joke. If someone asks me, do I believe in God? It isn't something I can easily answer yes or no to. For me, this isn't a yes or no question. First and foremost, because I often don't know exactly what that person is asking. Are they asking if I'm an ethical person? Or if I'm part of a certain club? Are they asking if I believe in their God, in their conception of God? How can I say yes or no without understanding what the word God means for them? And there's also the word believe. In our Christian tradition, this word is usually a translation of the Greek pisteuo, or Latin credo, words which can mean to trust, to rely on, or to commit oneself to. And if that's what my questioner has in mind, then yeah, I do try to rely on and commit myself to God. But I suspect that typically the question means something like, do you think God exists? Or do you think the statement, God exists, is true? Dionysius the Areopagite would say the statement, God exists, is not actually true. To recap, Paul had been traveling on his missionary journey through Greece and ended up in Athens, where some Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, thrilled to have some new ideas to debate about, invited him to speak at the Areopagus, the hill to the west of the Acropolis. There, Paul preaches against their idolatry, but he praises those among them who worship the unknown God. This is the God he's come to proclaim, he says, a God that can't be like the idols of gold or silver or stone, things that we know fairly well, because we are his offspring. And maybe I'll say we are her offspring. For the sake of Mother's Day, let's just use female pronouns. Greeks and Christians agree in this. God is unknown, and yet we know that we are her offspring. The writings we have by Dionysius, since they were authored by someone who makes an appearance in the Bible, had a kind of apostolic authority in the Middle Ages. Scholars today think they were actually written by someone later who just took that name, Dionysius the Areopagite, maybe as late as the 6th century, but in the Middle Ages, these writings were assumed to be authentic, even by people like Thomas Aquinas, so they were very influential, especially in bringing together Greek philosophy and biblical theology. The unknown God is central for Dionysius. God is not something like silver or stone, something we can sense with our 5 senses, or even really conceive in our human ways of thinking. Because of this, all theological language, when we say God is this or God is that, all of that is actually metaphorical. It's taking ideas and images we get from the world around us and applying these to the divine, where they aren't strictly true, but they help us get a sense of God. They bring us a little bit closer to her. The only things we can say about God that are literally true are negations. And that's the negative theology part. God is not this, or God is not that. And Dionysius illustrates this by looking at all sorts of names for God that we read in the Bible, starting with things that are more obviously metaphorical, like in Psalm 22, which says, "But I am a worm and not human, scorned by others and despised by the people," etc. We know that God isn't actually a worm. It's a metaphor. And on the flip side, that means that even something as lowly as a worm crawling on the ground can help us to understand some small aspect of the divine. From worms, Dionysius moves to things that seem less and less like metaphors, when God is called justice, or love, or life. And he'll say, yes, these ideas give us a sense of the divine, but even they are still just metaphors. And he talks about existence in that context. When we ask about whether something exists, we have in mind particular things of this world that are or can be present to our senses. That's what existence means to us. And if we say God exists, it helps us understand God's presence in a certain way. But it's not literally true, any more than to say that God is a worm. It is truer, in fact, to say that God is nothing than to say that God exists. Because saying that God is nothing is so close to the negation, saying God is not anything, which we know is literally true. When they read in the Bible that God created the world out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo, followers of Dionysius understand this to mean that God created the world out of herself, and that the world is actually God's way of coming into being, into existence. God's nothingness is a creative nothingness, and is in fact the source of all real creation. This way of understanding God and creation also impacts how we think about ourselves as human beings, individually and in relation to each other. When Genesis says that human beings are made in the image of God, Dionysian theologians will take this to mean that we also, at our very core, are nothing or aren't able to be understood. It's a paradoxical idea. It's like being selfless while at the same time tapping into the world-shaping creativity that is divine nothingness, so that we participate in God's own coming into being through creating ourselves. I don't know how you are all feeling about that. If all these words fit into how you think about these things, or if they just kind of sound like nonsense. That's the thing about negative theology. The point is to kind of move you beyond speech, but beyond what you can talk about, to an encounter with God in ultimately what is the silence of your own hearts. The metaphors that we use about God emerge from that encounter, and they express it in some way, but ultimately they're inadequate. The woodpile image from the children's story before. That's an image that's helpful for me to think through these things a little bit, even though it's also ultimately inadequate. Ourselves, our bodies, our dreams, our gifts, we're like wood that we gather together for a campfire. The purpose of that firewood is the fire, which we don't ourselves light. That's what God does. But we can kind of gather and piece together those gifts in such a way that it lights more easily, and the fire grows bigger when it catches hold. For me, this idea that we as humans are essentially or literally nothing, and yet somehow in realizing this, we're liberated to use the materials we have at hand, including our own bodies, including our own buildings, to create something new of our lives, to turn our lives and our communities into metaphors for God that reflect some of God's otherwise inaccessible light. This idea is something that I can honestly say yes to. I don't totally understand it, but when I read about it in these kind of Dionysian people, and then I think about myself and my experience in church, especially over the last while, I feel like it tracks. And more than that, more than assenting to it, it feels like tapping into a deep well that fills me and refreshes me. I think this is what believing is. And I'm not saying that this idea of God as not existing, or that our existence can be some metaphor for God. I'm not saying you have to share this conception. That's precisely the point, that our conceptions of God often make sense only from our own perspective, working with the materials that we have at hand as best as we're able to. But if you do choose me to be a pastor, you may have to occasionally suffer through me talking about this every now and then, as I try to kind of articulate it a little bit better, or use some better analogies than the campfire or my back pain, which I was going to include here, but it got kind of cumbersome and unhelpful, kind of like back pain, actually. I can just summarize it quickly. The idea here is that I have this weak disc in my spine that constantly gives me grief, but it's also been the stimulus for me to get into stretching and eventually into a bunch of things I do that I call yoga. And it's this kind of sad material state of me that nonetheless has allowed me to be creative with my life and discover some greater compassion for myself and others, and also learn more about balance and strength. But that's as far as that went. It's nice to have the Bible as a shared common ground or language for us to work with and discuss our different and overlapping conceptions of God. And also our shared Anabaptist heritage, which I would like to just highlight is not so far removed from some of these mystical ideas than one might guess. The mystical tradition of Dionysius the Areopagite has this lineage of thinkers. Eriugena, who is always lurking in the background of my sermons somewhere, kind of like that spider and grasshopper in the Mercer Mayer books. Eriugena translated him from Greek into Latin, and thus providing his thoughts for the Latin world. And I mean, there's a great story about that translation, how the emperor received this Greek gift of Dionysian's writings, but couldn't read them because no one in the West could read Greek at that time. I won't go into that. From Eriugena, this tradition is passed down to people like Aquinas and Meister Eckhart. You may have heard of him. And then we have Eckhart's disciple, John Tauler. Eckhart and Tauler were similar in a lot of ways. Most of their output was actually in the form of sermons rather than books. And they actually both did most of their preaching to women, to groups of nuns or the nun-adjacent women called beguines. But unlike Eckhart, Tauler hated theology professors. He thought they were just these stuffy academics who talked a lot about God but had no real encounter of God or with God in their own lives. Tauler had a huge impact on the Anabaptists, on early radical reformers like Karl Stadt and Muntzer, and on spiritual Anabaptists like Melchior Hoffman and Hans Denk. And he was the source of Anabaptist thinking around Gelassenheit, that we should give up our own will and let God's will work through us. Kind of like when my dad and my brother and I were trying to set up that tent and then just gave up, and it turned into something new and beautiful. I'll close with a quote from Tauler's sermon number 5. "Dear children, the great clerics and masters of learning dispute about whether knowledge or love is greater or nobler. But here, we want to speak about the masters of living, the Leibmeistern. When we come there, that is, to heaven, then we shall have a good view of the truth of all things. Our Lord says one thing is necessary." That's from Luke 10:42. What is this one thing that is necessary? The one thing is that you know your own nothingness. That is what is yours, what you are and who you are from yourself. Like other elements of our tradition, we can decide whether to carry this conception forward as we become masters of our lives, as we become Leibmeistern, and what role, if any, it will play in the theology that we teach our kids and our grandkids. Maybe it will end up being one of the logs that we gather from the forest of our tradition and bring to the fire pit as we build our bonfire together, setting up as best as we can the conditions for God's light and warmth to shine forth in this world, even if we as individuals get consumed.